A wealthy ranch owner who'd lost everything that mattered sat alone every night at a small-town diner until a 4-year-old girl looked him in the eye and asked the one question no one else dared to. What happened next didn't just change his life, it saved 2 others. This is the story of how a man who had everything learned what it truly means to have something worth protecting. The Hartwell Diner sat at the edge of Dust Creek, Wyoming, wedged between the general store and the blacksmith shop. Its wooden sign swayed gently in the evening breeze, paint chipped at the edges, but the glow from inside was warm, inviting. The smell of fresh bread and stewed beef drifted through the cracked window, mingling with the dust from the dirt road outside. Inside, the diner was modest. A dozen tables, mismatched chairs, oil lamps flickering against the walls. Locals came and went, cowboys fresh off the trail, families finishing supper before heading home, the occasional traveler passing through. But one man sat alone every night, always at the same corner table near the back window. Caleb Stone. He wore a fine black coat, tailored from back east, boots polished despite the dust that clung to everything in this town. His hat rested on the table beside an untouched plate of roast and potatoes. A man of wealth, of land, of legacy, owner of the Broken Wanderer Ranch, the largest spread for miles, with cattle that grazed as far as the eye could see. But tonight, like every night for the past 3 weeks, Caleb sat motionless. His fork hadn't moved. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago. He stared out the window at nothing in particular, his reflection faint in the glass. Strong jaw, tired eyes, a man who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. 3 weeks ago, he'd buried his father, the man who built the ranch from nothing, the man who taught him to ride, to rope, to run a business with integrity, the only person who ever asked him, "Son, are you happy?" Not "how's the herd?" or "what's the profit this season?" Just that, "Are you happy?" At the funeral, they'd said all the right things. Your father would be proud. You'll carry on his legacy. The ranch is in good hands. As if pride and legacy could fill the silence that now lived in every corner of that big, empty house. As if success could replace the voice Caleb would never hear again. The diner door creaked open. A group of ranch hands shuffled in, laughing, slapping each other on the back. A few glanced his way, recognizing him immediately. Caleb Stone, the wealthiest man in the county. Whispers followed, nods of respect, but no one approached. They never did. Wealth built walls, even when you didn't ask for them. Caleb's gaze drifted back to his plate. He should eat. He should go home. He should do a lot of things. But going home meant walking into that quiet house, hearing his boots echo on the floorboards, sitting alone at a table built for a family he'd never had time to start. So he stayed, night after night, ordering food he didn't eat, coffee he didn't drink, just to be somewhere with voices, with life, with people, even if none of them spoke to him, even if he was still alone. The room hummed with conversation, clinking silverware, the sizzle of something frying in the back kitchen. And for a moment, Caleb closed his eyes and let the noise wash over him. It wasn't comfort, but it wasn't silence either. He didn't notice the small figure approaching, didn't hear the soft patter of tiny boots on the wooden floor, not until a voice, small and clear, broke through the noise like a bell. "You look sad, sir." Caleb's eyes snapped open. Standing beside his table, barely tall enough to see over the edge, was a little girl. She wore a faded blue dress, her brown hair tied back with a ribbon that had seen better days. Her face was round, curious, her wide hazel eyes fixed on him with the kind of honesty only a child could muster. She tilted her head. "Are you okay?" For a moment, Caleb didn't know what to say. He stared at the little girl, her question hanging in the air like something fragile and unexpected. No one had asked him that, not genuinely, not in weeks. He cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse. I'm fine, miss. She didn't look convinced. Her small brow furrowed, and she leaned in slightly, studying him the way a child studies a puzzle. My mama says when people don't talk, they're sad inside. Caleb blinked. A flicker of something, maybe a smile, tugged at the corner of his mouth. It didn't quite form, but it was there. Your mama sounds pretty smart. The girl nodded seriously. She makes the best biscuits in the whole world. Biscuits make everything better. This time, he almost laughed. Almost. I'll keep that in mind. From across the diner, a woman's voice called out, gentle but edged with concern. Lily, sweetheart, come here, don't bother the gentleman. The girl, Lily, turned but didn't leave right away. She looked back at Caleb, her face scrunched with thought. Then, without warning, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out something small. A smooth river stone, pale gray, with a white stripe running through it. She held it out to him. This is my lucky rock. You can hold it if you want. It helps when I'm scared. Caleb stared at the stone resting in her tiny palm. Something tightened in his chest. He reached out slowly, carefully, and took it. The stone was warm from her pocket, smooth against his calloused fingers. Thank you, he said quietly. Lily smiled, bright and unguarded, then turned and skipped back toward the counter. Caleb watched her go, his hand still closed around the stone. He looked up and found the woman standing behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. She was young, maybe late 20s, with soft brown hair, pulled back in a loose braid. Her face was kind, but tired, the kind of tired that came from long days and little rest. She met his eyes and gave him an apologetic smile. I'm sorry about that. She's curious. Caleb shook his head slightly. It's all right. The woman hesitated, then walked over, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She refilled his cup without asking, her movements efficient but not rushed. She doesn't usually talk to strangers, she said softly, but she has a way of finding people who need a little kindness. Caleb looked down at the coffee, then at the stone still resting in his palm. She's got good instincts. The woman smiled, a little more genuinely this time. I'm Grace Hartwell. I run this place. Caleb Stone. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but not the kind he was used to. No awe, no calculation, just acknowledgement. I know who you are, Mr. Stone. You've been coming here most nights. He nodded. Food's good. She glanced at his untouched plate, then back at him. Her expression softened. Is it the food? Or just somewhere that's not empty? The question caught him off guard, not because it was rude, but because it was true. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. She seemed to understand. Grace set the coffee pot down on his table and reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out a small cloth bundle and placed it beside his plate. Lily's right, you know. Biscuits do help. Inside the cloth was a single biscuit, still warm, butter melting into its flaky layers. It smelled like home, like something his father used to make on Sunday mornings before the ranch got too big, before life got too complicated. Caleb looked up at her. You didn't have to. I know, Grace said simply. Then she turned and walked back toward the counter where Lily was already coloring on a scrap of paper, humming to herself. Caleb sat there for a long moment, the stone in one hand, the biscuit in the other. Two small things, ordinary things. But for the first time in weeks, the weight on his chest felt just a little bit lighter. He took a bite of the biscuit. It was perfect. Caleb Stone returned to the Hartwell Diner the next night, and the night after that, and the one after that. He told himself it was because the food was good, because the ride back to the ranch was long and cold, because it was easier to eat here than to sit alone in that big, empty dining room. But deep down he knew the truth. It was because of them, Grace and Lily. He never said much, just came in, ordered the same meal, sat at the same corner table, close enough to hear Lily's laughter echo through the room, but far enough not to intrude. She had a way of lighting up the diner, her small voice carrying stories about grasshoppers she'd found, clouds shaped like horses, dreams about flying over mountains. And every time Caleb walked through that door, Lily would wave at him like they were old friends. "Mr. Stone," she'd call out, beaming. Sometimes she'd bring him drawings, crayon sketches of the sun, stick-figure horses, a tall man in a black hat she said was him. Caleb never corrected her. He kept every single one, folded carefully into his coat pocket. Grace noticed. She always noticed. At first, she kept her distance, polite but professional. But over time, small things began to shift. She'd refill his coffee without him asking, remember how he liked his steak cooked, leave an extra biscuit on his plate when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, the diner was busier than usual. Cowboys from a cattle drive had rolled into town, loud and thirsty. Grace moved between tables with practiced ease, balancing plates, pouring drinks, smiling even when her feet ached and her back protested. Caleb watched quietly. Then, without a word, he stood and moved a heavy chair out of her path before she could trip over it. Grace glanced up, startled, then gave him a small, grateful nod. He sat back down as if nothing had happened, but she remembered. Another night. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the streets into rivers of mud. Grace stood at the window, frowning. Lily was curled up in a corner booth, half asleep, wrapped in a shawl. Grace glanced at the clock. Past closing time. She needed to get Lily home, but the storm wasn't letting up. When she turned back around, Caleb was standing near the door, holding his coat. "I'll walk you," he said simply. Grace hesitated. "Mr. Stone, you don't have to." "I know." His voice was steady, not insistent, just certain. "But I'm going to." So they walked. Caleb held his coat over Grace and Lily, shielding them from the worst of the rain. Lily, half awake, rested her head against her mother's shoulder, oblivious to the storm. Grace said nothing, but her hand brushed against Caleb's arm as they crossed the muddy street, steadying herself. When they reached the small house behind the diner, Grace turned to him. Her hair was damp, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Thank you," she said softly. Caleb tipped his hat. "Anytime." As he walked back through the rain, coat soaked, boots heavy with mud, he realized something. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what was in front of him. The next morning, Grace found something waiting for her at the diner's back door. A small wooden crate, sturdy and new. Inside were jars of preserves, fresh eggs, a wheel of cheese, and a handwritten note in careful script for Lily. Thought she might like these. C.S. Grace stood there for a long moment, the note trembling slightly in her hands. She looked toward the horizon, where the Broken Wanderer Ranch stretched out in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what this meant, but she felt it. The quiet kindness, the way he saw them, not as charity cases, but as people worth caring for. That evening, when Caleb walked into the diner, Grace met his eyes across the room. She didn't say anything, she just smiled. And for the first time in a long time, so did he. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening, when the diner was nearly empty and the sun was setting in streaks of orange and gold across the Wyoming sky. Caleb sat at his usual table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. Grace was wiping down the counter, Lily asleep on a bench near the kitchen, her small body curled under a quilt, one arm draped over a worn cloth doll. Grace glanced over at Caleb, then hesitated. She'd been working up the courage all week to say something, anything, beyond the usual pleasantries. There was something about him, something in the way he looked at Lily, the way he moved through the world like a man carrying more than anyone could see. Finally, she walked over, coffee pot in hand. She refilled his cup without asking, then surprised herself by sitting down across from him. Caleb looked up, eyebrows raised slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said quietly. He nodded. "Why do you come here every night?" Caleb's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly he set his cup down and stared at it, like the answer might be somewhere in the dark liquid. "My father died 3 weeks ago," he said finally. His voice was low, steady, but there was a crack beneath it. "He was the only person who ever asked me if I was happy. Not how the ranch was doing, not about profits or cattle prices, just if I was happy." Grace didn't say anything. She just listened. At the funeral, people kept telling me how proud he'd be, how I'd carry on his legacy. Caleb's hands tightened around the cup. But pride doesn't fill an empty house. Legacy doesn't answer when you call out in the middle of the night and realize no one's there. He looked up at her then, and for the first time she saw it, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the weight of being strong for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. "I come here," he said quietly, "because it's the only place that doesn't feel like a tomb." Grace's throat tightened. She reached across the table and rested her hand gently on his. "I'm sorry." Caleb looked down at her hand, then back at her face. He didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long moment, the silence between them not empty but full. Then Grace took a breath. "Can I tell you something?" Caleb nodded. "Lily's father left before she was born." Her voice wavered, but she kept going. "We were supposed to get married. He promised me forever. Then I told him I was pregnant, and he was gone by morning. Didn't even leave a note." Caleb's expression darkened, but he said nothing. "I was 23, broke, terrified." Grace's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I thought about giving her up. Not forever, just to someone who could give her more. 2 parents, stability, a real life." She glanced over at Lily, still sleeping peacefully. "But the moment she was born, I knew I couldn't. She was mine, and I was hers, even if I had nothing else." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't hate him. I just hate that she'll grow up wondering why she wasn't enough to make him stay." Caleb's hand turned over, his fingers closing gently around hers. "She's more than enough," he said firmly. "And so are you." Grace looked at him, tears spilling over now, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to hold it all together, not in front of him. A week later, it happened again. Grace was in the back room, sorting flour sacks, when one of the regulars made a comment, loud enough for others to hear. "Must be nice playing house with the rich man. Smart move, widow." The words hit like a slap. Grace's hands froze, her breath caught. She turned and walked quickly into the storage hallway, pressing her back against the wall, trying to hold it together. That's where Caleb found her, eyes red, hands shaking. He didn't ask what happened. He just handed her his handkerchief and sat down beside her on an overturned crate. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said softly. "Not here. Not with me." And for the first time, Grace believed him. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, when the sky was clear and the air carried the scent of wildflowers from the prairie. Grace had closed the diner early. Lily had been restless all morning, complaining of a headache, her small face pale and clammy. Grace pressed her hand to her daughter's forehead and felt the heat radiating from her skin. Fever. Her heart sank. The nearest doctor was in the next town over, a 2-hour ride by wagon. She couldn't leave the diner unattended, couldn't afford to close for a full day, but Lily's fever was climbing and her little body was trembling. Grace paced the floor, Lily curled up on the bench, whimpering softly. Panic clawed at her chest. She was alone. She was always alone. Then the door opened. Caleb stepped inside, hat in hand, his eyes immediately finding Grace's. He saw it all in an instant, the fear, the helplessness, the way she was barely holding herself together. "What's wrong?" His voice was calm, but his body was already moving toward her. "It's Lily," Grace said, her voice breaking. "She's burning up. I need to get her to the doctor, but I can't. I'll take you. No hesitation, no questions." Grace looked up at him, tears brimming. "Caleb, you don't have to." "I know." He was already lifting Lily gently into his arms, wrapping his coat around her small frame. "But we're going, now." Within minutes, they were in Caleb's wagon, the horses moving at a steady gallop across the open prairie. Grace sat in the back, cradling Lily's head in her lap, whispering soft reassurances. Caleb drove with focus, his hands steady on the reins, his jaw set. Halfway through the ride, Lily stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. She looked up at Caleb's silhouette against the sky. "Mr. Stone?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Caleb glanced back. "I'm right here, Lily." She smiled weakly. "You came for me." Something in Caleb's chest tightened. "Of course I did." Lily's small hand reached out, and he shifted the reins to one hand, extending his other back to her. She held onto his finger with what little strength she had. "You're my favorite," she murmured, her eyes already closing again. "You're my favorite grown-up." Caleb's throat constricted. He couldn't speak. He just held her tiny hand and kept the horses moving. Grace watched it all, her heart breaking and mending at the same time. This man, this quiet, grieving man, who owed them nothing, was racing across the frontier like Lily's life depended on it. Because to him it did. They reached the doctor's office just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The doctor examined Lily quickly, gave her medicine, and assured Grace it was a bad fever, but nothing that wouldn't pass with rest and care. Relief flooded through Grace so powerfully she nearly collapsed. Outside, Caleb leaned against the wagon, his hat pulled low, staring at the distant mountains. When Grace emerged, Lily asleep in her arms, he straightened immediately. "She's going to be okay," Grace said softly. Caleb nodded, but he didn't move. He just stood there, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Thank you," Grace whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Caleb stepped closer. His voice was low, rough. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Grace's breath caught. "Caleb, I mean it." His eyes held hers. "You and Lily. You're not alone." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly, Grace reached out and placed her free hand against his chest. She could feel his heart beat, strong and steady. "I see you," she said quietly. "Not the ranch owner, not the wealth, just you." Caleb's hand covered hers, and in that moment, beneath the fading light of the Wyoming sky, something shifted between them, something unspoken but undeniable. On the ride back, Lily slept peacefully between them. Grace rested her head on Caleb's shoulder, and for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the diner's door before sunrise. Grace found it while sweeping the entryway, a thick envelope sealed with wax, stamped with a lawyer's insignia from Denver. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a formal petition. Legal language, cold and precise, a demand for custody of Lily Hartwell, and at the bottom, a name that made her blood run cold. Vincent Crane, Lily's father. Grace's knees buckled. She grabbed the counter to steady herself, the paper slipping from her fingers and fluttering to the floor. He hadn't written, hadn't visited, hadn't sent a single dollar in 4 years. And now, out of nowhere, he wanted his daughter. She picked up the letter with shaking hands and read it again, this time catching the details. Vincent had remarried, married into money. His new wife's family wanted an heir, wanted respectability, and suddenly a daughter he'd abandoned became convenient. The letter demanded joint custody, and if Grace refused, he'd take her to court, fight for full custody, claim she was unfit, unstable, unable to provide. A second note fell from the envelope, handwritten in sharp, careless script. "Don't make this hard, Grace. Take the settlement. Walk away, or I'll make sure you lose her in front of a judge." Grace's vision blurred, her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. She thought of Lily, still asleep upstairs, safe and oblivious. The little girl who'd never known her father, who'd never asked for him because Grace had been enough. Until now. That night, Grace didn't tell Caleb. She couldn't. He'd already done so much, already stepped into their lives when he had every reason to stay distant. She couldn't drag him into this, couldn't burden him with a fight that wasn't his. So she smiled. She served meals. She laughed at Lily's jokes. She pretended the ground beneath her wasn't crumbling. But Caleb noticed. He saw the way her hands trembled when she poured coffee, the way her smile didn't reach her eyes, the way she flinched when the door opened like she was expecting someone. He saw the exhaustion, the fear she tried so hard to hide. Days passed. Grace grew quieter. She stopped meeting his eyes, stopped sitting with him after closing. She was pulling away, retreating into herself, and Caleb didn't know why. Then, one evening, he saw her. He'd left the diner later than usual, walking toward his horse, when he heard it. A soft, broken sound, coming from the alley beside the building. He stopped, turned. Grace sat on the wooden steps behind the diner, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The strong, steady woman who ran the diner with grace and grit was falling apart, alone in the dark. Caleb didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance in a few long strides and knelt in front of her. Grace. She looked up, startled, tears streaking her face. She wiped at them quickly, trying to compose herself. "I'm fine. You're not." His voice was firm but gentle. "And you don't have to be." Grace's composure shattered. A sob broke free, raw and unguarded. "He's back, Caleb. Lily's father. He wants to take her from me." Caleb's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "What?" "He sent a lawyer, says he wants custody, says if I fight him, he'll prove I'm unfit." Her voice cracked. "I can't lose her. She's all I have." Caleb's mind raced, but his voice stayed steady. "You're not going to lose her." Grace shook her head, tears streaming. "You don't understand. He has money now. Connections. I can't afford a lawyer. I can't fight him." Caleb reached out and took her hands in his, grounding her. "You're not fighting him alone." She looked at him, confusion and hope flickering in her eyes. "Caleb, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking." His voice was low, resolute. "I'm telling you, he's not taking her. Not while I'm here." Grace stared at him, her breath catching. "Why?" she whispered. Caleb's eyes softened. "Because you're not alone anymore. Neither of you." The next morning, Caleb rode into town before sunrise and sent a telegram to Denver. By noon, a lawyer arrived at the Hartwell diner, a sharp woman in a traveling coat, her leather satchel filled with documents and determination. She introduced herself as Margaret Finch, one of the best family attorneys west of the Mississippi. Grace stood frozen in the doorway, staring. I didn't call for anyone." Margaret smiled gently. "No, ma'am. But someone who believes in you did." Grace's eyes widened. She looked past Margaret, through the window, to where Caleb stood across the street near the hitching post. He tipped his hat, then turned and walked away. That evening, Grace found him at his usual table. She didn't sit down right away. She just stood there, arms crossed, eyes glistening with emotion. "You sent her." Caleb looked up, his expression unreadable. "I did." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything." He set his cup down. "You don't." Grace's voice trembled. "Caleb, I can't pay for a lawyer like that. I can't." "You don't have to." His tone was firm but kind. "It's handled. That's not fair to you." Caleb stood, closing the distance between them. "Grace, listen to me. I'm not doing this to be noble. I'm doing this because the thought of him taking Lily, of you losing her, makes me angrier than anything I've felt in years." Grace's breath hitched. "But why? Why does it matter so much to you?" Caleb's eyes held hers, steady and unguarded. "Because I care about her, and I care about you." The words hung in the air, simple and honest. Grace's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling over. "Caleb, I'm not trying to fix your life or take over," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to stand beside you. Let me do that." For a long moment, Grace couldn't speak. Then slowly she reached out and placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. "You already are," she whispered. Caleb's hand covered hers, warm and grounding. They stood there in the quiet diner, the weight of everything they'd both carried alone finally shared between them. Later that week, Margaret Finch worked swiftly. She filed counter-petitions, gathered testimonies from townsfolk who'd seen Grace raise Lily with love and care, and exposed Vincent Crane's true motives, his abandonment, his sudden interest only after marrying wealth. When Vincent's lawyer tried to intimidate Grace with threats of a drawn-out court battle, Margaret shut him down with cold precision. "My client has more character in her little finger than your client has shown in 4 years. If you want a fight, we'll give you one, but I promise you, you won't like how it ends." Vincent Crane withdrew his petition 2 days later. Grace stood in the diner, holding the dismissal notice in her hands, barely able to believe it. Lily played on the floor nearby, oblivious to the storm that had nearly torn their lives apart. Margaret packed her satchel. "You're a strong woman, Mrs. Hartwell. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Grace nodded, throat tight with gratitude. "Thank you." After Margaret left, Grace walked outside and found Caleb waiting by his horse. She didn't say anything at first. She just walked up to him and wrapped her arms around him, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to collapse. Caleb held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I don't know how to thank you," Grace whispered. "You don't have to." She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "You gave me my daughter's future. You gave me hope." Caleb's hand brushed a tear from her cheek. "You gave me something too." "What?" He smiled, soft and real. "A reason to stop sitting alone." That evening, they walked together through town, Lily skipping ahead, chasing fireflies in the fading light. And for the first time, Grace let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they were building something that could last. 3 months later, the town of Dust Creek gathered for something it hadn't seen in years: hope made visible. Caleb Stone had funded the construction of a new schoolhouse on the edge of town, a sturdy building with real glass windows, rows of desks and shelves waiting to be filled with books. It wasn't just for the children of ranchers and shopkeepers, it was for everyone. A place where any child, no matter their circumstances, could learn and grow. The dedication ceremony was set for a Sunday afternoon. The whole town turned out, families in their Sunday best, children running across the open field, the smell of fresh lumber and possibility in the air. Near the entrance, a bronze plaque had been mounted on the wall. Grace stood beside it, one hand resting on Lily's shoulder, reading the inscription quietly to herself. "A place to begin, built in memory of Thomas Stone, and in honor of those who give more than they take." She felt Caleb approach before she saw him. He stood beside her, dressed in a fine black suit, hat in hand, his presence steady and sure. "Your father would be proud," Grace said softly. Caleb looked at the plaque, then at her. "Maybe, but that's not why I built it." "Then why?" He glanced down at Lily, who was tugging on his coat sleeve, eyes bright with excitement. "Because she asked me once why some kids didn't go to school, and I didn't have a good answer." Grace's throat tightened. The mayor called everyone to gather. Caleb stepped up onto the small wooden platform in front of the schoolhouse. The crowd quieted, all eyes on him. For a moment, he just stood there, looking out at the faces, families, neighbors, people he'd lived among but never truly seen until a little girl asked him if he was okay. "I'm not much for speeches," Caleb began, his voice carrying across the field. "But I want to say something." He paused, his gaze finding Grace in the crowd. "A few months ago, I was a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. I had land, money, success, but I was alone, and I didn't even realize how alone I was until someone saw me." He looked down at Lily, who was standing beside her mother, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. "This little girl walked up to me in a diner and asked me if I was okay. No one had asked me that in a long time. And her mother gave me kindness I didn't deserve and didn't ask for." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "This schoolhouse isn't charity," Caleb continued. "It's gratitude. For a town that gave me a second chance. For a woman who taught me what strength really looks like. And for a little girl who reminded me what matters." He stepped down from the platform and walked directly to Lily. He knelt in front of her, pulling something from his pocket. A small silver locket, delicate and engraved. "This belonged to my mother," he said quietly, fastening it around Lily's neck. "She told me to give it to someone who made the world brighter just by being in it." Lily's eyes went wide. "For me?" "For you." She threw her arms around his neck, and the crowd erupted in applause. Then Caleb stood and turned to Grace. The noise of the crowd faded as he took her hands in his. "Grace Hartwell," he said, his voice steady but full, "you walked into my life without trying. You didn't ask for anything. You didn't need my money or my name. You just saw me, and that changed everything." Tears streamed down Grace's face. "I don't have all the words," Caleb continued, "but I know this. I don't want to go back to that empty house. I don't want to sit alone anymore. I want to come home to you, to her, to this." Grace's voice broke. "Caleb, walk the rest of this life with me," he said simply. She didn't hesitate. She nodded, then pulled him close, and he held her like she was the only solid thing in the world. The crowd cheered. Lily squealed and jumped between them, wrapping her arms around both their legs. Later, as the sun set over Dust Creek, the three of them walked back toward the diner. Caleb carried Lily on his shoulders. Grace walked beside him, her hand in his, and for the first time in a long time, none of them were walking alone. Inside the diner's window, a small hand-painted sign hung, swaying gently in the evening breeze. "Home isn't a place. It's the people who stay." If this story reminded you that even the wealthiest can be the loneliest, and that sometimes all it takes is one honest question to change a life, then you're part of something bigger here. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel. Every click helps us bring more stories of quiet love, second chances, and the courage to stay. Because sometimes, all it takes is a little girl in a faded blue dress to show us what really matters. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.